This is the fourth of 5 work sessions on the comp plan. It's followed by at least 4 hearings. This is, of course, a staff work session. We won't be taking public testimony. We're going to focus on transportation today. Obviously, we've been looking in previous sessions about managing growth and housing and employment, and the transit and transportation piece is pretty important, because if we're going to grow more 20-minute neighborhoods, then we have to have a transportation system integrated with the plan that accomplishes that. So that's why we hope we will have our Director of Planning and Sustainability here. We certainly have our BPS staff, but we have our Transportation Director here. So I don't know if you have any other opening comments, Commissioner Novick, since this is your neck of the woods, but
none whatsoever.
Okay, then we'll turn it over to the team to walk us through the presentation and lay out the issues that we're going to be dealing with on the transportation element.
All right, thank you, Mayor and Commissioners. I'm Leah Treat, masquerading as Susan Anderson for the moment. So I'm just going to read, she sent me her note. So Susan says, before I start, I just want to say that unlike a lot of cities, your transportation department and your planning department work very closely together, which is very true. As a result, the planners have better technical understanding, and the transportation staff understand planning, zoning, and land use policies. So we're a very good team. To provide some context for talking about the transportation system plan, let me remind you about some of the comp plan's underlying assumptions around growth. A primary focus of the comp plan is to promote wonderful, walkable, and complete neighborhoods. These neighborhoods are developed within centers and corridors, places like Hollywood, Lentz, Sellwood, along Interstate, Division, and elsewhere. We anticipate that about 50% of all new growth over the next 20 years will be within these centers and corridors. Also, we are likely to see more than 250,000 people move to Portland by 2035. So 50% of that is 125,000 more people in those centers and corridors. In addition, we anticipate about 30% of growth to happen in the central city, so that's roughly 75,000 people. The remaining 50,000 will move into our neighborhoods throughout the city. Good morning. We know to support all of these places, we need to build quality transportation infrastructure, and we need for people to use the infrastructure. We also know it's literally impossible to build our way out of this situation. There isn't just enough additional road space or right-of-way. So the transportation system plan is the tool that we use to figure all this out. And it includes the long-range policies and a project list. These are for how we propose to meet the increased transportation demand over the next 20 years. And before I hand it over to Leah, I do want to make a quick observation. You missed the fun. I'm Susan Anderson right now. I think our transportation system is now at a place where our electric utility system was 20 or 30 years ago. At that time, demand for power was outstripping supply, and so we had 2 choices to make things work. We could either increase supply and build our way out of the problem, or we could reduce demand. And I think we're in the same place now with transportation. For electric utilities, reducing demand has been a huge success. Over the past 30 years, the Northwest states together have reduced demand by more than 4,000 AMW. I don't know what that is. In real terms, that's about 8 to 10 new power plants that did not have to be built. Thank you. Doing a poor job being Susan. In many ways, we've already begun. We need from shifting cars to bus and rail and bike, and to people moving on their feet. So from my perspective, there's 3 components to the shift. One is infrastructure, more buses, more bikeways, more light rail, more sidewalks. The second is complete neighborhoods and a vibrant downtown that provide everything you need within a short walk or a bike. And a third is the least understood and most underfunded. It's social-based marketing and financial technical assistance and financial signals to help people make the shift. This last category is often underfunded and hard to quantify, but it is essential. Lots of cities have infrastructure, buses and bikeways, but often with nobody on them. We have to make transit, bike, and walking easy and literally make it the most normal, most cost-effective, and the easiest thing to do, so that driving to work and paying to park is more expensive and more time-consuming. TDM measures need to be a part of the transportation system plan, just like all the projects. They're not just an extra or a nice to have. They are essential. Okay.
Good job, Susan.
Thank you. So I do want to thank Susan a lot for the close partnership that we've had with her, and especially with Eric Ingstrom. We've worked very closely with them to develop the transportation system plan. And I do want to thank Art Pierce on my staff, Courtney Duke, Peter Hurley, and Zeph Wagner, who have worked tirelessly to produce this document before you today. So the culmination of our work that you're looking at today has taken 8 years, which to planners is actually just a snapshot in time, but for the rest of it, it's quite a long time. And if you think about it, it's actually the time since the iPhone was invented. And if you think over the last 8 years and what technological advancements have come to us, I think that's also emblematic of what we're looking at over the next 8 years and in the 20 years of the transportation system plan. And like Susan said, I don't believe that we're going to be able to build our way out of the problem. In order to successfully manage density and growth, we do need to shift people to alternate travel modes. So the TSP that we've developed have a lot of firsts for the city, and firsts that I think we should be really proud of. One example, and the one that I'm most proud of, is we have developed a financially constrained list. This is the first TSP that puts a realistic list of projects in front of you given constrained resources. I think this is important for us to consider as public officials, but also it's very important for us in our conversations with the public for them to understand what transportation is able to accomplish given varying funding levels. We also used a new set of project selection criteria, and these were developed to line up with existing plans and goals that the city has already adopted. For example, the Climate Action Plan and our equity policies. We created performance metrics. This is going to help us as we move forward to measure our success and be more accountable with the public, and also to guide conversations with the public about how we are implementing the plan. And I will say that while we have worked incredibly hard and with very sincere intention, I do believe there are groups that would like to see further refinement to the TSP. We heard a lot from the freight community, and I know that you all heard a lot from them last week during the economic development session. During the development of the TSP, we did make changes to our transportation hierarchy in response to the industry input, and also in recognition to make some changes to meet growth projection for the freight industry. And I will say that I believe our key strategy in order to meet our industrial lands deficiency is going to be through transportation changes to increase access to the industrial lands that we do have. I also believe that no neighborhood group believes there are enough projects in their area. So I'm actually proud of the fact that we created a project selection criteria and a public engagement process during the development of the plan that allowed everyone access to the projects that we selected and input. So not just people who understand how the system works and have access to public officials got to weigh in on how we selected criteria. We did a robust public engagement process, and many of the projects were moved around as we developed this as a result of input. And we also changed a lot of project scopes based on public input. And I also want to say that I kind of believe that planners move in geologic years. So instead of waiting for the TSP to be formally adopted, PBOT is charging ahead now with a lot of the new policy and project criteria. Specifically around equity, I'd like to point out that PBOT has reclassified an existing vacancy and has hired an equity and inclusion manager. It's one of 6 in the city, and we are moving forward on equity and inclusion work. We have also adopted Vision Zero policies. The council adopted a Vision Zero policy, which we're very proud of. And we are making historic investments in East Portland. We are making huge investments in sidewalk, access to transit. We're working with TriMet to restore frequent service on 122nd Avenue. And we're in the project development phase for a bus rapid transit route that goes through East Portland all the way to Gresham. So we are charging ahead, but very excited about this conversation that we're going to have in the adoption of the comprehensive plan and the TSP element. And with that, am I turning it to you?
Yes, I think so.
Art's going to dive into further details.
All right.
Thank you.
So the packet you have in front of you, produced through the tireless efforts of Aaron Egner, Erin Agner, who's a new staff person with PBOT, helping us. She is a information designer, is her trade, and I think you'll agree by the end of the show that she's done a great job with translating really complex information into something that's digestible. The agenda we have for you this morning, after this introduction, which we've just done, I'm going to talk some about the overall approach to transportation. Eric Engstrom's going to talk about the relationship to land use and the comprehensive plan. We'll speak a little bit then about some sort of broad themes that you're observing and things you have questions about, and then we'll go deeper into the financial plan, the projects and programs list, and the specific comments and recommendations that are coming from the Planning and Sustainability Commission. So the next slide, so the first one is the one with all the cars on it. So as both Susan and Leah have mentioned, growth is coming, and at a very rapid rate, and it's something that we should be very proud of. We've created a place with the City of Portland that is where people want to live and people want to move from throughout the country and throughout the world. And we do know that our road capacity is not sufficient to accommodate that growth if we're continuing to trend with our current mode share of how people travel and how people get around today. So we know we have to shift our behaviors and shift the way that we invest in our system in order to encourage that shift. The next slide, which has this triangle on it, shows from 2010 to 2035, if we stay on the current trends of how people are traveling, that leads us to, I think, Mayor, yours is you have an old version in front of you. Yeah. Okay. I realize you're flipping around. Yeah. Is that we have a trip gap of about 500,000 motor vehicle trips per day that will be increasing the traffic on our streets, increasing congestion on our streets. And so as a city, we need to come up with a very intentional way of reducing the amount of motor vehicle traffic growth by directing traffic to other modes. That is the increase in motor vehicle trips between 2010 to 2035. So I think many of us can viscerally understand that amount of increase from about 1.5 million to 2 million doesn't seem possible the way that the system seems to be functioning today.
Does that include freight?
That includes freight, yes.
But is it fair to state that more flatly? We do not have and will not have the road capacity to handle those trips by cars.
Correct.
So it's just in case anybody's wondering.
There's no ambiguity
what
about
can
it.
we
Yeah.
What can we do to the roadway system to handle that many cars? Nothing.
Absolutely.
Right.
And as I entered into this
Even
job
if we
about
wanted to make all those
a year
choices.
and a half ago, I tried to come up with other answers because it would be great if there were other answers.
Right. But I think they're.
Yeah. Right. Well, and there certainly are. I mean, a street, I live near 33rd Avenue. We could widen 33rd Avenue to 2 lanes each direction. It's a very, very congested street. I don't think that represents the type of Portland we want to create. And so that's really is the visceral choice that we have and think in front of us. We also have a larger issue as the center of a prosperous region. We are also receiving the trips from throughout the region and wanting to accommodate freight through movement trips throughout the city as well. And so it's not just that we, the city, need to do better. We need to lead the region in doing better as well. It does matter to us, the travel behavior of citizens throughout the region and throughout the state. All right, so the next slide. In a very, again, Portland themed, the best transportation strategy is a land use strategy. Susan, we've reserved a slot for you, right? No. Yeah. She did great. She did great. So the best transportation plan is a land use plan. If we're able to create places where people can meet their daily needs through shorter trips and trips that don't require an automobile, we are making the system work more efficiently and allowing for freight movement to occur. So the emphasis on centers and corridors is actually a very, very essential transportation strategy as well as a growth capacity for housing and employment. All right, one more slide. So as you've already heard a couple themes from Susan and Leah, is that our strategy in Portland is to encourage making trips, those shorter trips, through walking, biking, and transit. And so we very specifically talk about making pedestrian trips the most attractive for short trips. Biking being the more attractive than driving for 3 miles or less, and transit the preferred mode for travel that can't be made by walking and biking. Very, very clear articulation of how we want to see people movement occur. And that is essential for supporting those longer trips that need to happen by car or are too long to be accommodated through transit or freight or too dispersed to be accommodated through transit and freight. And then also of key essential is that freight mobility, the cost of our goods, the prosperity of our businesses is really, really hinging on us producing space on the roadways for those motor vehicle freight trips that are those higher value trips that we want to encourage.
Is another issue, again, in terms of both substance and how we talk about it. I mean, the picture, the photo of Barbara, I think, really helps highlight this. I think if we want to be clear with people that we cannot accommodate the growth we're going to have with the automobile mode split we have today, and if we are not as a community willing to widen streets like 33rd to make them carry more cars. The other thing that we will also have to do is take right-of-way that now is dedicated to automotive purposes and dedicated to transit and bicycle and pedestrian purposes. And we might want to be that explicit with people with streets like Powell, Division, 82nd, Barber, that in order to handle the growth, we will take lanes that are now auto lanes and make them transit lanes. Because we cannot move the transit that carries more people than a car lane ever could through that landscape if the transit is stuck in traffic. And when we get to the specific design issues of the Powell Division BRT project, I think some people will be surprised that it means there will actually be less auto lanes in those streets. There will be less auto lanes in those streets than there are today, because you cannot move buses magically through congestion without, I don't know, I think we might want to be that direct about that we're not choosing to prioritize transit because we believe transit is a good thing, but because in order for it to work in a more congested landscape, we will have to dedicate what are now general purpose lanes to be transit lanes.
And world-class bikeways need a little bit of space too.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so I mean, if we're shifting scarce right-of-way is limited. We're not going to widen 33rd. We're not going to widen a lot of streets like that cannot be. I can't think of a street we can widen, frankly. So if that's the reality, then we ought to be, I think, clear with people, because I don't know how many people share that understanding. And they think, some people hear that and think it's an ideology. It's not. It's a recognition of scarce space. So I guess as we get out into the public with those discussions and with those projects, I want to think about how we present that.
Thank you, Art. I'm going to start off with a somewhat complicated diagram that explains the relationship of the transportation system plan to the comp plan. And the thing I want to zero in there is that in the middle of the diagram, there's some dotted lines around a section. And the transportation system plan is overlapping with the comprehensive plan. It's not quite the same thing, but it has elements of it that are part of the comprehensive plan. And that's why we're updating it at the same time. But there are also parts that are not embedded within the comp plan that have other functions. The key parts that you are considering at this stage are the ones outlined in the dotted lines in the middle, which includes the goals and policies, the high-level goals and policies of the transportation system plan, which are within the comp plan, the list of significant projects, in this case the transportation projects, and then Art mentioned and Leah mentioned the financial plan being critical to that too. So that's what's before you over the next few months as we move into hearings. What is not yet before you, but will be before you by the end of next year, are further updates to the street classifications and cleanup of master street plan issues, and then other parts of the transportation system plan that exist outside the comp plan, additional details and codes. And those pieces are now moving through the Planning and Sustainability Commission, and I believe are at the discussion draft, but will be soon at the PSC. And so you may actually get a little bit of confusion in the testimony because we have these two elements going at the same time, and the first of which is before you, and the second of which is going to be before you by next year. And so we've already seen some of the testimony come in that is about that second piece, and we'll just have to continue to talk that through. Getting up my teleprompter here. So transportation policy, I want to start off a little bit with that. It's primarily in Chapter 9 of the Comprehensive Plan, but there's also pieces in Chapters 3 and 4 and 8. 3 and 4 are the design and development chapters, so because land use is linked to transportation, there's some pieces there that are important. And then Chapter 8 is the public facilities chapter, which governs all policies around public facilities, including transportation. The transportation goals in the plan are consistent with those larger goals of the comprehensive plan, emphasizing, as Leah mentioned, safety. The Vision Zero is, I believe, the first goal in the Chapter 9, but also public health, prosperity are significant goals in that as well. Again, mirroring the larger theme of the comprehensive plan. These goals and policies were developed with the help of an advisory committee consisting of a whole lot of folks from different community and interest groups, including representatives from the different modal committees that the city operates. So the freight committee, the pedestrian advisory group, the bicycle group. And it's been very helpful to have all those people in the same room working through these issues. It took a couple of years, but it was a significant amount of work, and I think worth that public involvement. Also worth mentioning that the project list was a part of our online map app, so that there was quite a bit of involvement in that as well. I'd like to emphasize a few policies that are particularly significant within the larger set. One of the big shifts is in how we evaluate transportation system performance and adequacy. And this occurs through the development review process, but also when we're evaluating designs of capital projects. Currently, we have a system that evaluates success based on vehicle mobility and vehicle delay. And then where there are problems, we can mitigate those by encouraging alternatives like biking and walking or transit. The new policy starts out with the idea that we should have a set of multimodal performance measures from the start. In other words, the availability of transit or sidewalks or the availability of a low-stress bikeway is a relevant factor in determining adequacy from the start, not just as a secondary consideration when there's a mobility problem for vehicles. And so that's a subtle shift from a policy perspective, but really important, and it's part of how we need to move forward to shift modes, as was discussed earlier. Other states, California, Washington, I believe British Columbia as well, have already kind of gone in this direction. So we're probably the last major city on the West Coast that still uses vehicle mobility as our core measure of success. Another important policy has been referred to as the transportation hierarchy. It asks the city to consider the most vulnerable road users first when making right-of-way design and implementation decisions. So what that means is too often we've engineered the road to meet the vehicle level of standards, and then if there's extra space, there's some wider sidewalks or potentially a bike lane. And this says, no, we need to start off at the beginning by understanding that we have to start with the sidewalk and the bike and accessibility for the most vulnerable users as part of that design process. Another piece that's important is there's actually a new automobile mode policy. We've not had an auto mode policy before, at least at this level, and it emphasizes looking at new technology, cleaner fuels, and bringing the folks who are in cars, and I should mention that even as these mode shifts occur, we're still talking about probably more than half of all trips still being made by automobiles. So it's not something that cars are not disappearing from our system. So these policies are important. There's a significant new policy section emphasizing transportation demand management, as was discussed earlier in some of Susan's points. There's new policy that one size does not fit all in design. So it may not be possible to have a sidewalk on both sides of the street on every street in the city. We may need to pay attention to steep slopes in the West Hills may have a different street design than the floodplain in East Lents, and that's okay to think about that context. And that's kind of a new idea in the comp plan that's parallel to the larger comp plan policies around looking at neighborhood context a little bit more with our design decisions. I would probably be remiss if I didn't mention that there is overhauled parking policy, and you had a work session on that a few weeks ago. One of the shifts there is to refer to the parking lane as the curb zone, and that kind of recognizes the fact that it's not always a parking lane. It's sometimes more appropriate to use it for other things. I could talk a lot more policy details, but I think it would be better to shift to I think this is the first discussion period. Is that correct, Art? So where are we? Questions?
So I'd like to know more about what's the transit strategy, and it specifically, is there, recognizing that we're not TriMet and recognizing that it just doesn't work unless more people use transit. Are there policies calling for us, for example, to advocate for a fareless system or better funding for TriMet, those kinds of things?
I'll let Eric jump in a little bit as well. The main pieces, and actually this was pushed a lot through Andre Baugh's leadership in the conversation, was the realization that for centers and corridors to thrive, we're reliant on TriMet's transit service, and not just rail service, but bus service as well. And so we created a letter of intent showing, sort of documenting the deep level of collaboration that we're moving forward with. And honestly, a lot have been moving forward with, but showing that intention with TriMet, that as we invest in access to transit facilities, TriMet will be investing in greater frequent service and greater service elements.
But what about the issue of the cost of service? I think a lot more people would use transit if it wasn't $5 a day.
There are not current policies about that.
So, Andre, it sounds like you've done a lot of good work on this. Is that something that the Planning Commission and Sustainability Commission looked at?
We did not. The first part of that kind of thinking was, let's get transportation and TriMet just having a common goal to think about bus service and make sure that, there's the argument TriMet won't do bus service because there's no sidewalks, and vice versa. So let's make sure at least the bus can get there, people can get to a bus stop, as kind of the first thought of that coordination and agreement to work together. I think you're right, though. Long term, you need to talk about the cost of transit. And in a sense, I think when they get to the project list, there was an attempt for us to look at solutions around how you look at transit and what are the options out there that are on the project list that would make sense, at least for East Portland.
And I would add that we do have a comp plan policy supporting the youth pass and the extension of the youth pass to more of the city, which is definitely a transit affordability policy.
So, colleagues, I encourage us to be more bold. I think we should, at least for youth, be saying that this system is free, ongoing for everybody. And if we really want to encourage people to use it, it can't cost more than your little Prius telling you that the driving cost a fraction of the cost of, just for gas.
Right.
Of taking the bus.
Question about that, Commissioner. I mean, I don't know that driving, when you really consider all the costs of driving, is generally cheaper than transit. I mean, I think that generally transit, if it takes you where you want to go, is in fact cheaper than driving. And also, if we're going to, we actually are assuming that TriMet makes major investments in building out the transit system. We'll see that further on, and we're going to have to somehow raise revenue to do that. So if we're calling on TriMet to reduce the cost of transit, which I think is a good idea in theory, then we'd have to say that we're calling on an increase in taxes in some way in order to pay for that.
Yes, that's precisely what I think we should do. I think that we should be general taxes or an additional funding source for TriMet in addition to the payroll tax is something that would be good for our community.
one of the emphasis that occurred, and there was quite a bit of discussion in the Planning Commission about this, is usually transportation system plans are fairly focused on capital improvements for the next 20 years. And we deviated from that a little bit and spent quite a bit of time talking with TriMet about service improvements on the standard bus system. And in particular, the TSP through the TriMet service enhancement plans is pushing for expanded frequent service transit in East Portland. And there are a couple lines on 122nd, 148th, and 162nd that were specifically advocated through this process and are now.
Just one other note, the main policy goal that we have in the evaluation that we did was around transportation costs overall. So it wasn't specifically looking at transit versus auto. It was saying that, you know, we want to reduce the cost of transportation overall within someone's household's budget. So among a variety of choices, we're trying to create a more complete set of options for those citizens. Yeah.
And I certainly appreciate the recognition of a constrained budget and the prioritization thereof. When we're discussing housing, we set some pretty bold targets that we may or may not be able to reach. I think it worthy of looking at in the comp plan setting, you know, in a perfect world, this is what we would like in the next 20 years.
So I was wondering, there's something called the Transportation Affordability Policy.
So that's specifically that.
Is this the same issue we're talking about?
It is the same issue, and it's related, but it's speaking specifically to one of our goals is to reduce the portion of someone's household budget that's spent on transportation, and that's part of giving them a series of options of safe walking and biking facilities, transit access, all those things will reduce the percentage of cost. And we actually have a map later on that will show you that actually lays that out in physical terms. You'll be able to see the parts of the city that are spending higher proportions of their household budgets on transportation.
And that's intended to be linked with our housing affordability policies so that we're looking at household affordability integrated with transportation and housing.
So let me take off on that discussion and maybe go back to page 8. I think there's another box that we need on that series of plan boxes, and that's the streetcar system plan. So let me sort of pose a couple of things here. So in the last 20 years, we built, maybe I'm going to lose track, 12 or 14 miles of streetcar in 7 phases. What are we assuming in the next 20? How many miles, which corridors, what order? Then are we planning, so I believe we should be clear in this comp plan that these are the next, I'll pick a number, 6 phases of the streetcar that are going to occur. We're sure these 3 are going to happen in the next 20 years, and therefore we're mapping for those, just like we're mapping for the Division Powell corridor and the Barber corridor. In other words, we're not getting around to mapping for the transit that we hope to have. We're mapping for the transit we expect to have. And I don't know if we're yet clear about what those next, say, 3 streetcar corridors are. I know there are opinions about that.
Yeah.
But remember, this is not just a enthusiasm for mode. We went to the regional table last time around and said, you don't have to expand the urban growth boundary as much. We will take this area of the city and accommodate this many more households, in part because we're serving it with a streetcar, namely the Pearl District and later the South Waterfront. So that regional argument continues. Well, Portland, can you really accommodate 140,000 more jobs and 260,000 more people? Do you really have the inventory and the plans and the policies in place to support that? Will you stick to that? Are you serious? So I think we have to be able to be clear for ourselves and for the region that, well, we're not done building, or if we are done building streetcars, we ought to tell people that, but I don't think that's the answer. If we're not done, we're going to go here next and there after that and there after that, and we've mapped for it. So you, the property owner on this corridor, should expect to participate in the development of that streetcar line, because then you will get to realize the potential that we've already mapped for in our plan. So that's where I hope that we're running towards here in these converging land use and transportation plans, and that given that TriMet isn't responsible for the expansion, for the planning and expansion of the streetcar network, we might want to have that more explicitly called out in our own plan. So, Chris,
So the
prob-
PSC weighed in quite heavily on that point. And we actually took a streetcar project out of the constrained list, and I'll talk about that, where that fits in the big picture. So we do not have a map of the next streetcar corridor projects. What we do have is a study, the Inner Ring Transit Study, that we've added to the list, that's intended to look at the Inner Ring is now our term for the neighborhoods immediately outside the central city, which are going to be some of the biggest receivers of growth over the period of this comp plan. So we have a transit study for those neighborhoods intended to identify those corridors. The best planning we have now that Eric can share more about says that Macadam clearly has the most potential with the streetcar investment to increase densities and make the kind of great places to live that we like, that have been the hallmark of streetcar success in Portland. But that needs to be paired with other investments, probably on the other side of the river. We don't know specifically which those would be, whether it's Sandy or MLK or Broadway to Hollywood, and that study is intended to get at that. But the PSC also felt quite strongly that there was an equity question, and that the next transit capital project after Powell Division also needed to be in East Portland. So we have put in a study asking PBOT to look at what kind of capital transit project would benefit East Portland most strongly, and that should probably go before the next Inner Ring project as a matter of equity to get the kind of infrastructure in East Portland that we enjoy in Central Portland. So that's the sequencing on that. I also think that we're going to have to ask more of our streetcar projects. It's not enough just to deliver great mobility and more density. We're also going to have to figure out how they deliver things like affordable housing, which in places like the River District, where we had strong TIF, was a possibility. We don't have those tools in the places the next corridors are likely to go. So we need to figure out other ways to make sure that we deliver those benefits from an equity point of view that are not baked into the current tools.
From the technical point of view, what BPS and PBOT did is some further analysis of the streetcar master plan to try and figure that question out of what should be advanced with the comp plan. We did not come to consensus about the order of that, as Chris mentioned. He mentioned a few of the possibilities. There's, we looked at Macadam and some way to get to Hollywood, either Sandy or Broadway, and we looked at MLK, and there's some discussion of further alignment changes in the Conway area. So those are the strongest possibilities that came out of that technical analysis, but there is not consensus about the order. And as Chris said, the proposed TSP at this point does not have streetcar in the financially constrained project list for the next 20 years. So that should be made clear that that's not currently the TSP plan. So that's, if the council wants to talk about that, that should be discussed.
we should talk about that. Again, I have no quarrel with the equity and ordering issue that you just articulated, but seriously, no streetcars in the next 20 years?
On the constrained list.
Well, but I'd like us to discuss and deliberate on that question, because I think it will be difficult for us to accommodate the growth that we're forecasting without that.
And I'm inclined to agree with you, but I'd also say that taking the streetcar out of the constrained list made virtually no difference in the total financing, because streetcar projects bring their own incremental capital sources. So if we do the planning and we identify the right projects, bringing them in, may absorb some SDC dollars on the order of a few $1 million, but we're also going to have to bring in the incremental financing to do that. So I think not being on the constrained list is not really the barrier. The barrier is doing the planning to know what the right projects are.
Issue to public discussion and council discussion as well, because I think you got to look that one in the face.
Can I just, this was a significant issue, and I kind of led the charge here. This is an issue of focus, to me. When you look at hierarchy of transportation, kind of in a pyramid, like a Pavlov's dog, you get to what is basic transportation, what is maybe superior or better transportation, and then what is superior. Streetcar to me is the top of a pyramid. It's the top 20% in terms of delivering economic development and transit, because it's really an economic tool. Buses are basic transportation. It's block and tackling that you need to do every day as a city. We've talked about complete neighborhoods. We've talked about, in the economic side, jobs and where people live and putting people to jobs and reduction of their cost of living through transportation. That's a goal of this comp plan. The focus here is there's not money dropping out of trees out of the federal side anymore to build transit projects. The thought was from kind of commission was, let's get PBOT focused and TriMet focused on how do we deliver to 25% of the population, 42% that are low income, that are transit dependent, that are car dependent, that go to corridors, that work in corridors, that don't have good transportation links. It's not that a bus doesn't go to the ports and along Columbia Boulevard. It's that the bus comes every 45 minutes and takes 2 hours to get there. It's still $5, but you can't why spend half of a day getting to work and back, and it's not reliable? How can we get I don't know what the answer is, but how can we get a reliable transportation system and get PBOT and TriMet focused on getting a reliable transportation system to deliver to this population that's staying in cars longer? That's a climate action plan, but it's also an affordability plan. And if we can do that and get the money around that, the thought was, well, then, yeah, go build down in John's Landing, build on MLK, build on Sandy, build somewhere else. But let's get this problem focused, because if we miss this one, you can always build on John's Landing, but if you miss this one, the residents out there are not in complete neighborhoods. They're in what they call a desert now for transportation, and we're trying to do that better through focusing transportation. That was part of the MOU that I wanted to get PBOT and TriMet talking about transportation focus. And this is another way to get the idea focused around how do you deliver that transportation solutions. It's great to talk about streetcar, but streetcar's fancy. It's kind of the spread offense. Everybody likes it, but no one likes 3 yards in a cloud of dust like a bus. And so you get a lot of people, saying, oh, we don't want to talk about that. But that's what a significant part of Portland needs. And we need it to address these issues around not widening streets. We need to be able to take a significant population and put them to their jobs on a reliable piece of transportation. Not sure what that is. We didn't know, but we said, this is your first idea of a study. And this idea actually came out of and was adopted in the Portland plan. And we've continued that thought process now in the comp plan.
Okay, I'm not sure if I followed that, so let me re-articulate what I was trying to say and make sure I'm tracking with the PSC here. No question we need better bus service, and we ought to be assuming better bus service in the land use map, right? But we also, I believe, ought to be assuming transit expansion. So sort of set streetcar aside for a minute. I'm hope and expect that the map for the Powell Division corridor assumes the development of the project. We're going to adopt a map next year. So I don't want to say, well, we're going to hope there's going to be a project and adopt a map that hedges our bets, because then we underbuild the opportunity in redevelopment and we don't accommodate 260,000 people and 140,000 jobs. So sort of put the mode aside. I actually would disagree with your proposition that the federal government's not there. They're still funding 50% of transit capital, just like they always have. We had 80 for a while, but that was just a little sweet interlude. But it was a very lucrative sweet interlude, but it was just that. So they're still doing what they always have done. Actually, it's one thing the federal government has continued to do reliably, which is fund 50% of transit capital projects that qualify. So that's still there. But my point is, I think we should assume that the Barber corridor is going to happen. We'll figure out the mode here shortly. We'll figure out the route here shortly, the details of the route, and likewise with Division Powell, and likewise with some version of the streetcar system plan, that we should assume it's going to happen in terms of the land use map. I'm thinking more about the Planning Bureau's work than PBOT's here, though it's obviously feeding off of the work PBOT's done and is doing.
And Mayor, I think you're correct. In terms of the land use map, we have assumed both Barber and Powell Division, both corridors have mixed-use zoning and land use designations in place that support those projects, as well as the comp plan designations in what the inner ring that he referred to. That is built on an assumption of better transit and proximity to the central city. We were mode agnostic in terms of how that gets done, but it's clear that on a corridor like MLK that the current land use you can't support that land use with the current number 6 bus, for example. Something has to be done, and that's the study Chris mentioned.
Mayor, if you look a few pages down the line, under the constrained investments list does assume Powell Division high-capacity transit, Southwest Corridor high-capacity transit, and Portland-Vancouver light rail. I think that if we're going to add, anything that we add to the constrained investments list either means that we have to assume we get more money from somewhere or something else comes off the list. It is something of a zero-sum game.
What I would have said at the beginning if it wasn't repeated, because I was on the orange line and the electricity died on the bridge. So, and if I had taken my bike, I would have been here. But having the transportation system looked at as a utility, just like natural gas or electricity or the water or sewer bureau, I think will help us in the long run. We're not going to be there for this plan right now to fully think about it that way. But I think if we move towards more of an integrated resource plan and try to optimize for what is it we're really trying to get. Are we trying to get ridership? Are we trying to meet equity goals? Are we trying to meet carbon goals? And really look at the suite of options. They range from all of these infrastructure projects to building complete neighborhoods to doing all the things that we think of as soft, the TDM measures. And a lot of times those TDM measures are way more cost effective than building more infrastructure. And we tend to think of that as a soft thing and it's a nice to do and it's a nice to have. But I'd like us to begin to move in that direction. So giving price signals to people to get them into their car. All the things that have made, these shifts in the energy world like normal, so that it's just normal to do all the weather now, finally, for a utility to want to do the conservation measures first before they go build another power plant. It's the same thing. If we can figure out ways to make all the buses full all times of the day instead of building more infrastructure, I think, then we're on a different path. We don't have the technical tools to do that right now. Almost no city, I don't think, is really quite there yet, but I think that's where we're moving in our planning, over the next decade.
I'll keep us moving to the finance plan, and then we'll be able to swing back around at the end for more discussion. A lot of what we talked about actually was slated for the very end of the conversation, so we've relieved ourselves of some of that later conversation. So this is Mark Lear, who manages our resource development work for the Bureau, and he led our financial plan development, and he actually led the financial plan development of the last TSP as well, so he's well qualified for this endeavor. So he's going to walk us through the financial plan pages here.
Mark Glear, Portland Bureau of Transportation. Thanks, Art. And it's a good day for me. 10 years ago, worked on this plan and come back today, and there's active conversations and debates about the financial plan even before we do the presentation. So thanks, Commissioner Fritz, for throwing out that question of, how do we think about operations and maintenance in either other agencies? I think Eric's response to it where he said, that old way of looking at these transportation system plans really focused almost completely on new improvements. And we're trying to get a lot smarter about existing maintenance requirements, as well as operations, as well as relationships between agencies. And so I think those kinds of ideas, though they've been traditionally kind of outside a little of what we talked about, are really good for us to send those kind of signals to our agencies and partners and community and that sort of thing. So, and just before I jump into the financial plan, along those same lines, there's this assumption that everybody just jumps over really quickly in the financial scenarios that we put together for like this TSP and for the region and the regional transportation plan, that you just sort of take care of maintenance. It's this utility idea, I think, Susan, you're talking a little bit about. And the assumption in the RTP is that there'll be a 1 cent, we're a little bit smarter about it than we used to be 10 years ago. The assumption is in the RTP is there'll be a 1 cent increase in the gas tax every year in the 20-year cycle, and that's dedicated to maintenance. And that's good, but you have to keep reminding people that we have this responsibility, basically a 1 cent increase in the gas tax every year, 20 years, at the regional level. At the city level, we sort of need something similar just to deal with the maintenance side. That said, this part of the
So
focus.
is there a plan for that? Is anybody talking about doing a 1 cent a year for 20 years?
It's included in the, in our regional conversations. When we have like this Thursday, there's Oregon Transportation Forum conversation where they're going to be talking about statewide needs. And one of the ways they're trying to address that 1 cent increase is indexing the gas tax. So it is being talked about. Again, it's, a hard conversation.
Statewide rather than metro?
Yeah, and when I said that in the regional transportation plan, there's this assumption of a 1 cent gas tax increase. It was at the state level, that 1 cent increase that was in the regional plan. Yeah, thanks for the question. So with that background, I'm going to jump into the financial plan, talk a little bit about how we put that together and what it is. So this slide that you see in front of you now is that 5-step process. So the first step was basically looking at the existing revenue sources that we have. We have 17 existing revenue sources, and we identified 10 new sources that you'll see in the constrained and the unconstrained revenue scenarios. Again, 3 revenue scenarios, which I'll be walking through in the next couple slides in more detail. The other thing that we did this year in step 3, which was different than in previous years, is we looked at some of the constraints that are on different revenue sources. So for example, the money that comes through Metro, federal dollars that are allocated through the Regional Flexible Fund process, now are allocated 75% to active transportation and 25% to green economy. It's a way of starting, like you were saying, Mayor, of being really strategic about how we're making these investments. But we're using those assumptions in our financial assumptions. So as we look at the project list and we talk about the new criteria that we're applying it to, we have some more ideas about where some of those constraints. And let me just give you this one quick example of, I think, how important this is. When you look at our existing revenue sources for capital projects, the 3 biggest revenue sources, if I had to guess, I wouldn't have got this right. But the first one is improvements that we get through private development. $193 million in this financial plan is assumed to be, as development's occurring or we're building to code, we're actually building the improvement. So those things that you do in this room of saying what those requirements are going to be and where they're going to be end up being really important. That's the main way that we're funding our transportation improvements. The second one on the list at $75 million, the first one, was system development charges and then the private development piece. I got those flip-flopped. And then urban renewal as the third piece. But again, if you look at that, sort of development-related fees are a major portion of what ends up funding the improvements under existing resources, and probably why there's this challenge of funding those things that aren't related to development as well. But what we tried to do with this is really get a little bit more background on that, on where those funding sources and what requirements that had. And then the 4th and 5th steps of this process is marrying the projects, the criteria to these funding sources and building those scenarios. With that, I'll jump into these next couple slides. The first slide is what we call existing revenue. That our assumption is there'd be $800 million in the 20-year transportation system plan. About half of that comes from local sources. I was just describing the development-related sources end up being the lion's share of that amount that we have currently in capital. The one thing that I'll say about the existing funding scenario, and I hate to be a wet blanket, but this existing funding scenario assumes that these revenue sources keep pace with inflation. That's is harder than it looks, as this council and lots of others know. So there's the existing funding source has some of that already baked into it. Jumping to the next slide, you'll see the constrained revenue scenario, and this I want to talk a little bit more detail about. This is the revenue scenario that we use to model outcomes that Art will be talking about a little bit later. But our assumption in constrained, and again trying to be realistic about this, not assuming that there's a bunch of money coming from the feds, but assuming that most of our self-help here is going to really be coming at the local level. We assume $371 million of additional revenue at the local level and $187 million from the state.
And just to clarify, I mean, this is for improvements to the system. This is not for maintenance. And just as a point of reference, in the sort of straw man proposal that we've put out for how we would spend 4 years of a 10-cent per gallon gas tax, the straw man assumes 26 million in system improvement investments, which would leave us with a gap of 345 million instead of 371. So we're 25 million of the way, 26 million of the way there.
I think just to add on to that, good point is that in the local funding source, we identified something called the Portland Street Fund. Have a little bit of flexibility since we know there's still a pretty active conversation about what those local funding sources could be, but we use basically the revenue targets that we've been developing in our streets conversation as a way of saying something's going to happen on this soon, hopefully, and we'll use those assumptions out through the 20-year period. But at this point in the plan, we're calling it local revenue from Portland Street Fund. So jumping to the last financial scenario, this is what we call the unconstrained scenario. And again, almost all of the revenue assumptions that aren't local, the ones that are state or regional, we just use the assumptions that Metro put together when they put the RTP, the Regional Transportation Plan, together. But the basic assumption here is that we assume all the funding increases that were in the constrained. We add 25% growth to all the revenue streams unless there's some reason that we don't think that's true. So for example, tax increment revenue right now we think is volatile and committed to other sources and things enough that we're not predicting a 25% increase that in the out years. But most revenue sources we have made that increase. And so that's where you get this $2 billion estimate of available resources.
Okay. So back to me. I'm going to walk you through the major projects and citywide programs. So in the sort of arena of the possible, we have a total of 406 projects. 331 of those are projects that would be led by the city of Portland, and 75 projects are other agency projects that would be led by the port, by TriMet, by ODOT, that are essentially acknowledged within our comprehensive plan, acknowledging that these other agencies are also pursuing them and that they're key to supporting the growth outcomes. So a total of 406 projects. So the next slide brings us back to that gap between the revenue projections and the candidate list projections. And essentially, we were left with this challenge of how do we decide if we're going to really produce a constrained transportation projection, how are we going to decide which projects are included in the constrained financial projection and which ones aren't? Particularly given the limited resources, we wanted to make sure that the investments that we make help produce the outcomes that we're trying to produce through the comprehensive plan and the climate action plan and other plans. So it means that we really need to be targeted. We can't just invest at random and hope that things get better as a result. So the next slide shows a whole series of plans that were essentially distilled down together into 7 outcomes that we felt like were common amongst all of these different plans: the climate action plan, the Portland plan, freight and pedestrian and bike modal plans, direction from the state, and then also the land use direction. So these are improving access to daily needs, eliminating transportation fatalities, improving health, increasing economic benefits, ensuring equity, reducing climate impacts, and prioritizing the most cost-effective projects. And the key for this was trying to find the projects that could hit multiple of these outcomes through one investment. So the best projects are able to make headway along all of these fronts. So the next slide shows the major project list. So within the constrained, we determined that 254 projects at approximately $1 billion would be possible within the constrained, and that an additional 77 projects are outside of that constrained forecast, so it's something we don't think we'd be able to accomplish in the next 20 years. All right, the next slide. How we arrived at that. So those 7 outcomes were then combined together with additional criteria to create 11 criteria in total. That we then used GIS spatial analysis. We used the expertise of city staff We relied heavily on our transportation expert group, the advisory group that's been along for the ride with us for a long ways. Thank you, Chris, for many, many hours. But then also, very, very importantly, community support. So utilizing the MAP app, we were able to get information about community support. So the next slide. All right. So the MAP app is the tool that we use both for response to the, or maybe I jumped ahead one. So yeah, the one in blue here, yes. The MAP app was the main tool that was used in terms of getting feedback on the project, in addition to lots of public outreach, in-person events all throughout the city. We did receive about 900 comments specifically on the TSP projects. People were able to click on a specific project and give their feedback. And we did then include in the scoring of projects ones that had higher public support were able to work their way up. The other thing that was really useful with the public support is we were also able to get feedback on ways of rescoping the projects so that they could be more financially achievable. So in Southwest, for instance, Marianne led Sweeney folks through a pretty robust conversation around how to rescope some of these projects that we just haven't been able to get to, such as Capitol Highway. Is there a way that we can reduce the cost of those projects to make them more accomplished? So the next slide shows the Transportation Deficiency Index. So this was used to score projects that are sort of dealing with issues of connectivity, of pedestrian and bike access, and as well as safety improvements and places where there's substandard streets. So the projects that are remedying those areas with high deficiencies receive additional scores. One more slide. Equity was also a key factor in this. And so we specifically were scoring projects based on their ability to help improve the mobility of places where there's higher incidence of people of color, lower incomes, youth, and older adults. And so those projects also achieved higher scorings through that. The access to employment and the access to, oh, sure, yeah.
I don't want to get too far down in the
Nope.
weeds, but maybe later. I'm puzzled by some of the projects I see on the map. For example, interdivision, we just did that. So
That should be listed as a funded project, so that by color it will be showing it as a, unless actually I think this is part of the Palo Division Transit investment. So that may
not the
be.
part down by Ladd's Addition. We just
Right.
redesigned and rebuilt that street. So I'm not sure why we would have it on a project
I
list.
think at the time of this, the interdivision was part of the potential corridor for the Division Fast Link, is my guess. So Division Fast Link, which is the overall project that is in the TSP, I think may still be showing up in this location because the alignment hadn't been refined at the time when we were doing this analysis. But we can look into that.
I'd be curious to just,
You bet.
going
Oh,
back
sure.
to Foster, we funded and designed a remodel of Foster from Powell to Lentz.
There are some projects that are still in this list that, because they weren't finalized by the time this was done, we kept them in.
Yeah. Just asterisk that for later. Yeah.
Because we've accomplished it, that's great news. So, yeah. Right. This very colorful map is an example of the analysis we did in terms of access to work and access to education. So this is specifically looking at East Portland and where East Portlanders work, but showing specifically the types of projects that can help make the connections between East Portland and those locations were also prioritized within the process. The red shows where they're working. So a really strong connection to the Clackamas industrial area as well as to Columbia Corridor, for instance, and out by the airport, but also obviously connections farther afield as well. Yeah, Clackamas industrial area. I think that is OHSU, yeah. Yep.
And this is a pattern that we talked a little bit about in the employment discussion the other day, is that it's surprising how few of the East Portland residents are working downtown, for example.
It would be interesting to contrast this with other areas to find out. In fact, maybe
Right.
not quite as many people work downtown, and then looking at it, what you really need is transit that goes north-south and not downtown.
Correct, and that's, I think, why Andre's nodding is this has been a key message that he's been saying, and that's why we wanted to highlight this specific map is showing that that's something that we definitely have heard and are rewarding the projects that help us do that work. Yeah. All right, next slide. Going back to kind of the beginning of our conversation, we need to support the prosperity and the functionality of centers in particular, if that is our growth strategy. So we specifically looked at access and mobility connections to those centers. And so this is in white, you can see the various centers, and then see where the transportation investments relate to those centers. So specifically projects that were making connections to and between centers were also ranked higher within the overall process. But not all centers are the same, as we know. And in particular, and I think this is a graphic that you've seen before, probably earlier on in your conversation around growth, is there are certain centers that are projected to be growing very, very rapidly over the next 20 years, but also have deficiencies today. And so those top right centers, in particular those that are out in East Portland, are centers that we need to pay particular care for and make sure that we are making them complete through this investment strategy. So those are the specific ones. So it says that the key down below, the orange circles indicate those centers that have a higher than average concentration of vulnerable residents. And so mapping those, it is a very useful lens in terms of understanding. And so mapping them, the next page, you see this is a map of the TSP project investments and how they intersect with those, in particular East Portland centers. And so you can see how those investments help with health outcomes, with equity outcomes, as well as those access outcomes. So this is one where those investments scored well on a number of different criteria based on the growth and the deficiencies that they're experiencing. This relates back to, the next slide relates back to Commissioner Fritz's commentary earlier around transportation costs. So the average transportation cost of our residents also was incorporated into the evaluation, and looking at how can these investments really reduce the cost of transportation for these households. So you'll see that areas of Southwest and sort of both outer Southeast and outer Northeast pop on this map as having a cost above average for transportation. And so the investments that we make in terms of bicycle and walking and transit investments all can help reduce the costs of the transportation within a household budget.
Do we have a target goal we want to be at in terms of average transportation cost? Like we do for housing, you want to spend more
I
than
don't
30%
believe
of
we
your
do.
income? Or-
Do we?
We have a 50% combined housing and transportation costs, and you usually think around 30%, so it's around 20, but.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, thank you. That shows the bar charts, specifically shows across various modes where the City of Portland's investments are targeted. You'll see we're trying to follow through on the policy direction received from the comp plan, so we're really focused in on projects that supporting all modes, supporting bicycle and pedestrian mobility, and freight mobility and transit as the places where we're investing. And you can see the investments by other agencies are primarily focused on transit, freight, and freeway investments. Some of them are all modes. So we're in the blue, sort of filling in where we think we need to really support those policy directions from the comprehensive plan.
What does the comprehensive plan say about the Columbia River crossing?
I'll punt a little bit to these guys. So the comprehensive plan, I believe, is silent on the specifics of the CRC. It is still in the regional transportation plan, and so at this point now, I think we're waiting for that conversation to be resolved regionally. But I think I'll let Chris talk a little more.
Yeah, I think we might have been happy to take it out, but we were told by staff if we did that, we'd be out of compliance with the regional plans and it would get sent back to us to fix ultimately. But we did, and Andre provided the leadership on this, and I'll let him comment. We did add a study of developing mobility options from Portland to Hayden Island. because that's, a big piece of what the CRC was to deliver that it's not, and we still have that problem as a city of taking care of, our citizens on Hayden Island. And I think it's interesting that, former Metro President David Bragdon was in town recently talking about some of the problems he sees in transportation planning in Oregon, and one of the things he pointed out was letting the state highway departments lead the CRC was probably a mistake. It's an urban transportation project. The cities probably ought to be in charge. So in some ways, this study is our bid to get the city to take a more proactive involvement in figuring out what we should do, since that project isn't going anywhere. I'll let Andre add to that if he wants.
No, I think Chris said it best. We didn't take it out, but we really emphasized what do we do for multiple modes to get to Hayden Island long-term. And not sure what those options are, but to at least engage in a study that gets us some options on the table.
All right, so next slide. This actually circles back around to an early conversation as well. Understanding the coordination with TriMet and Portland Streetcar Incorporated is very, very important to supporting the projected growth. In part because a lot of those transit investments are implemented by others or with the support of others. So we did develop and execute a intergovernmental agreement, a letter of intent, essentially between us and TriMet to demonstrate our collaboration moving forward. And then we're a very active participant in the service enhancement planning process with TriMet. And we have the ongoing coordinative work with Portland Streetcar through the Permanent Executive Group that was formed out of the master agreement that the council adopted a couple of years ago with Portland Streetcar. And so it's very specifically looking at how transit service can be increased within these key centers and between them, as well as what access to transit investments we can be making in terms of pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure to make those connections. The major projects at the bottom, are very specifically to Southwest Corridor and Powell Division are sort of a lot of the big ones. We are right now through TGM grants, Transportation Growth Management grants, doing two different efforts. One of them looking at that sort of co-investment between us and TriMet in terms of where we would produce access to transit and better zoning to support vibrant places, and TriMet would reward us with better service in those locations, as well as a specific evaluation of those inner and outer corridors. We're just beginning that to look at where the right investments might be for that.
Pound on that nail just a little longer, and that is, I want, one of my goals for this plan is to make sure that, let's take 82nd again, that if we're going to confer the benefit of significantly higher density to the property owners along 82nd, we're also going to have some expectations in return that we will have developed a future street plan for that neighborhood that shows where the missing streets will be. And because we're conferring the benefit of higher density, those property owners will be able to afford to build those streets as they redevelop their used car lots into mixed-use developments. So I'm expecting that the fine-grained street planning will accompany the mixed-use designations in the proposed comp plan, and that we also will have a housing affordability and strategy that's congruent with that. We hope with inclusionary zoning allowed by the next legislature in time for us to complete the plan. So, in other words, we have a chance to get it right in terms of all these goals converging in these transit corridors. But and these two bureaus work wonderfully well together, but we need them to work wonderfully well together, as well as PDC and Housing Bureau, to make sure that we have that whole set of issues collaborated.
So I hope I'm misunderstanding this chart. The color bar is,
Each of the geographies are the colored bar, so these are the district coalition boundaries.
that's the share of projected households is the colored bar.
The colored bar is the share of projected households.
And then the black
The
line
black
is.
bar is the proportion of investment from the TSP.
So I've really appreciated the attention to equity and the discussion at East Portland. However, this chart seems to show that we still haven't come close to allocating the funding where the households are going to be.
Well, in this case, both in East Portland and in Southwest, we're investing more than where the projected growth is coming. So the black bars are showing that we're remedying deficiencies essentially. So what we're doing with the black is showing that there's deficiencies in East Portland and Southwest that merit our investment beyond the growth that they're projected to receive. Yep. But I think it is very important. We had to say no to a lot of people to achieve that, and so that will be something you'll be hearing in terms of feedback from a whole variety of players, that this was not an easy thing to have this level of determination against.
Yeah, sure. I'm glad I was wrong, and well done. Even better. It shows perfectly clearly that we're doing the right thing.
Okay.
When we when we established the Office of Equity and Human Rights, and that ordinance said that it would require disproportionate spending in underserved areas to get everybody up to equity. So this really mirrors that. It would be, at some point, we need to fund neighborhood involvement, community engagement, to make it catch up and to get to parity. And so, Council, I'll just give you a heads up that even though we won't be able to do it in this year's budget, ONI is going to be coming with a plan for that.
Great. All right, and so the last one is essentially taking those two growth and investment together into a spending per future user. And so it's showing a proportion of the TSP against the projected number of people in those locations. So you're able to see sort of proportionally the cost per user or spend over the 20-year period.
It's not annual spending.
This is not annual spending. I wish. Yeah. But this is able to be able to, as a quick reference, to kind of understand where the proportional investments are going.
And the high number for Southwest is reflective of the fact that Southwest is just kind of an expensive neighborhood to do business, given the topography, et cetera.
Yeah, it doesn't include Southwest Corridor because that's an investment by others. So this is just city investment. It does include a portion of the cost of the Ross Island Bridgehead. So that's one of the larger costs there. So that is part of why that number is large. Yeah. Only the local match proportion for that. So there'd be a little bit of funding, but not relative to that bigger, the amount of those bars that we're showing in orange on that earlier slide are not shown in this. I think that's the, sorry, no, it's not. So one of the, I forgot, it just keeps coming. So actually the part that I think is, I can't believe I thought we were done, that I actually think is one of the most exciting innovations of this round of the TSP is that we created these new citywide transportation programs and included them sort of explicitly within the TSP as very, very important investment packages. And this is specifically trying to find a way to bundle and cluster and make more efficient the expenditure in those small improvements that really are the most, frankly, often the most important to community residents and to local businesses. This is those smaller investments that are hard to get grant funding for. They're harder to reach out to broader statewide funding packages because they're too small for that scale of funding, right? So by clustering them together, we hope that we can try to start creating a whole sort of series of investment programs. And so if you go to the next slide, you'll see some examples of what those are. These are the things that are honestly the things I think we all know and love as sort of key elements. These are things like safe routes to school, high crash corridors, the pedestrian network elements, alternative street design on those streets that may not be able to have full improvements, the completion of the bikeway network, and there's a couple more even on the next page. Neighborhood greenways, focusing in again on what Susan was really pushing on in terms of transportation demand management and parking, very specifically helping with those, and then investments in transit priority and freight priority and overall transportation system management, making sure that we are, those high value trips of transit trips and freight trips are rewarded as they're heading through the system.
So how did you decide on the allocation for the amount of funding? I'm looking at 24 million for bikeways versus 9.5 for transit and 9.5 for freight.
I think I'll let Mark.
The main way that we did the estimate was looked at when we were doing the R Street conversation, how much money we were allocating in that conversation toward these types of improvements. So if we looked at like how much we were allocating to high crash or pedestrians improvements, we just tried to carry that forward. There were a few of those categories that we didn't have, like freight and I think maybe some of the TDM stuff that wasn't included in that. And so for those, we used kind of just general estimates based on some of the other revenue streams. We can provide a lot more information, detail on that too.
Well, yeah, particularly on freight, because we just had the discussion of economic development and remembering that there were 500 million in freight improvements in the North Reach plan. It seems like this is kind of a low number.
Yeah, and maybe just a couple quick thoughts on that. I mean, first, just on the freight one, the one that's a lot of the big freight projects that are most compelling to the freight community and our freight advisory committee are on the regional transportation plans. That's part of why you don't see them here. ODOT would own a lot of those, but I think the one thing that we haven't mentioned, and Art's team's done a really nice job of this, is these programs are really the way that we interact with the public. They're often the public gets it. They're coming in and saying, why can't you do this $500,000 improvement? Why can't you do this $250,000 improvement? So the one thing that I think will really help them with a lot of the outreach stuff and with neighborhood involvement as well is they're taking these programs and putting them up onto the internet, making it really accessible so that people will be able to much more easily say, okay, is my project on this list? Where is it prioritized, and see that? And that was one of the big concerns we had in some of the outreach in the TSP. So it's a really, I think it's a major process improvement of how we're going to be identifying some of our most effective projects.
And really, I think, the key, as Mark was mentioning, is this starts to reward public involvement where someone is able to see impact at the very local level. They want to see a new crossing happen at where they see there's a safety issue. They bring it to staff. There's a funding stream for that staff to leverage. They're able to make that investment and reward that community member for caring, for stepping forward. Right now, that's a very untenable, very frustrating process, frankly, for staff, because they don't have this pool of resources to be able to say yes. So they're spending a lot of time finding more articulate ways of saying, I'm sorry, rather than being able to say, yes, we will deliver this for you. And so these programs are that method that we can start more and more renewing and rewarding that civic engagement.
Commissioner, there are a number of $10 million plus freight projects on the larger project list that's outside of these smaller programs, specifically to support access to parcels that are opportunity sites for the economic development.
I forgot you said these are the bundled ones.
Yeah, this is the little guys.
Just so you know, the very first thing I got involved in Portland was getting a cross street sign on Capitol Highway. And it got done, and I thought, well, this is great. You can participate and get things done.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah. We want to see more of that.
It doesn't make the traffic slow down the way I thought it would, but, the sign is there.
Right, exactly. So this is, we really think this is the sort of block and tackle game for the city of Portland and for the Transportation Bureau, and we feel like this is where we should be putting ourselves forward, even in the upcoming budget cycles, as a key way of demonstrating that we mean it. We want to invest in these types of improvements.
So, let me flag something else. It's both an equity and a mapping issue, and that is one major project that I don't see on this list, at least articulated separately. Maybe it's implicit in one of these, and that is our strategy over the 20-year period for dealing with our 50-plus miles of dirt streets. So how's that proposed to be addressed?
I believe that's an alternative street design, is the low-cost improvements. I believe that's the intention. We may need to make it less wonky sounding to make it clear.
Yeah, I think we might want to be explicit. Might want to be explicit in the plan about what do we expect to do over the 20-year period. Andrew Abe's been doing great work with LIDs lately. We've increased the rate of effort on LIDs. I think at the current rate, we'll get it done in 100 years instead of 200. That's an improvement. But what do we expect over the planning period in terms of both strategy and dollars with respect to that issue?
Good. All right. So
Just to make you feel better, I assumed that was included in alternative street design.
Okay, good. All right. So I know we're throwing a lot at you. One additional slide, and then we're going to get a chance to talk some more. And so this is a very simple way of showing what do we get out of this. So you remember that trip gap, that triangle at the very beginning. This is showing that the modeling shows that out of the investment package in the transportation system plan, the land use growth pattern that's projected in the comprehensive plan, and the TDM strategies that we believe will need to be embedded in part of this in terms of encouragement and education, that this investment package is able to reduce vehicle trips by 475,000 vehicle trips. So it doesn't get us to where we are today, but it gets us a lot better than we would be if the status quo was where we were progressing. And we really believe that we can achieve that final trip gap through specifically more bicycle mode increase and TDM strategies, because those are the ones that are very, very inexpensive, and we believe there's still a lot of latent demand for those throughout the system. The graphic on the right is one that you're likely familiar with, but it is showing that specifically within a constrained roadway system, if we're able to produce mobility through a variety of outcomes, we can move more and more people across the same facilities with using the same amount of space. The Hawthorne Bridge is, I think, a great example of where that has continued to function over the years by increasing the amount of transit use and the amount of bicycle and pedestrian use.
Actually, Art, I don't recall seeing this particular graphic before, and I think it's awesome, and I think we should build like a 3,000-foot billboard over downtown with this graphic on it.
Right. Good. Okay. So I think this is a chance to maybe talk for a little bit, and then we'll shift to the PSC recommendations. Give just a second if there's other feedback, and then are there?
I just have a quick, as we enter into the PSC, talking about how they came to decisions. Going back to, there's a slide that shows all the different plans and the 7 outcomes. Each of the planning commission members were really looking at what were they trying to optimize for. And there's the 7 outcomes here. Because you do really different things. If you're trying to move freight that's your highest, goal, versus you're trying to reduce carbon emissions, or you're trying to help lower income families. And each one of you want to do all of those things, but you can't optimize for everything. That's, it doesn't really work that way all the time. And so I think as we're looking at the project list and you're getting down into it, and you're going to have people coming up and testifying to you about one project versus another, trying to keep in mind what's most important to you in terms of what you're trying to optimize for.
One thing, I'm not, there's too appropriate time to say this, but I think I have to say it somewhere, that we do recognize that not all segments of all streets can be all things to all people. So although, for example, for people movement, we are prioritizing the low carbon modes of people movement, we acknowledge there is going to have to be freight movement, and some segments of some streets are going to be primarily dedicated to that.
Absolutely. Yep. One of the key things about the 7 outcomes and the criteria, how it produced, it was really rewarding projects that were able to achieve a whole number of different outcomes simultaneously. So you may not be able to achieve all of them, but those investments that are able to both create prosperity and help with climate and help be very cost effective were rewarded for being able to achieve multiple fronts simultaneously.
List in order for the PSC recommendations.
So we've already talked about several of these. Let me briefly address the project list. The big subtraction was the Macadam streetcar, and again, the 2 reasons for that: one, sending the equity signal about the need for a capital project in East Portland, also the desire to take a more complete look at the inner ring, so we're not doing Macadam as a standalone project, but compare it with a larger expansion of the system in the inner ring. That freed up, even though that was an $80 million project, it only actually freed up $6 million of money we can point at, and we reallocated that to active transportation projects in East Portland and Southwest Portland that were just the other side of the bubble for the constrained list. So we picked the next projects of merit and moved those forward. The studies, to say what those should be, are intended to be timed to inform the 2018 RTP project list. So this is not, a 10-year figure it out. This is a pretty short-term deliverable to inform the next regional project list. In terms of policy changes, big emphasis on safety. We injected safety into a number of places in the policies. We included a policy specifically calling out motor vehicle diversion as a way to make neighborhood greenways work, and you're already way ahead of us with that, and having directed some pilot projects to do that on neighborhood greenways. So we seem to be in alignment there. A lot of work and discussion, even up to the very last minute, on what we have variously called the transportation hierarchy or transportation strategy, how we order the modes. I think 2 big changes there. One is we separated the hierarchies for people movement and goods movement, recognizing that they have competing drivers and trying to put them in one list did not make a lot of sense. And actually, a lot of work in the transportation expert group to see where the conflicts were between that. You know, it tends to manifest as, you know, we can't fit both freight and a bike facility on the same segment of the street. And, you know, really digging into that, happily you find that the places where that's true are a short, enumerable list of things that we have to work on case by case. So there's not really a policy statement about how to sort that out, but a recognition that it's a relatively rare problem when you get into the real world, and we're going to have to work each of those at the project level individually. Within the people movement strategy, we, and I credit the leadership of my colleague Gary Oxman, who's the retired public health officer for the Tri-County region, to inject the concept of vulnerability along with the policy goals. So, you know, we could say, for example, that, you know, in our policy goals, we tend to go, you know, walking, biking, transit. When you look at vulnerability and safety, it's a little different because, yes, people walking and cyclists may be the most vulnerable users, but then hardly anybody gets injured on a light rail car or a bus. So, you know, the next safety objective goes somewhere else, not to transit, and trying to sort of weave both those thoughts in. And honestly, we're working on that right up to the last minute, and there may be some opportunity for amendments before you guys vote to further refine that, but that was an important part of the conversation. Did I miss anything, Andre?
And kind of a challenge that comes out of the comp plan and came from the Portland plan, and there was this idea of equity, and you've heard Leah talk about how equity has been integrated into delivering, you know, a comp plan, but more explicitly a transportation plan, and how that concept, and it's not a challenge to the streetcar saying we're not going to do streetcar, it's saying what is the priority first? You can still do streetcar, but can you look at capital improvements in parts of the city, and where can we start first, and what can we do next? And the concept of, can we do multiple objectives, as Art talks about, and achieve multiple objectives with capital projects, so that we not only build good capital projects, but we achieve affordable housing, we get prosperity, we get people to their jobs, we complete neighborhoods, and we do all those things with a project versus just saying we built a capital project and got transit. And the challenge, I think, is how do we do all those things in the next 20 years? And we can build streetcars. We're just saying, is that the first priority, or is there another priority? And it may not be streetcar, it may be something else, or it may be streetcar. But how do you integrate this issue of equity with all the other objectives in terms of economic development, housing, the environment, and transit? That's really the challenge of a transportation project.
Before we go to next steps, other thoughts? Excuse me. Before we head into next steps, which is kind of the direction, are there other thoughts on all those maps and pieces? Are there pieces of information that you were wondering about that wasn't included? I think we were pretty exhaustive in what we brought to you, but and certainly expect that you'll have probably referenced them in the coming weeks and days, and may have more questions. So we're happy to go into more detail on any of those. Before we kind of head into the sunset, I want to make sure that give you a moment to think more about this.
What were some of the most controversial things, and what were things that you didn't put in the plan that caused angst on the Planning and Sustainability Commission and or in the community?
I think one of the challenges was by using a constrained funding scenario, and by specifically evaluating the projects. There were projects, some of them that are popular, but didn't get as far up, or didn't get up as far up as they otherwise would be based on solely on a popularity basis. And so that was hard, I think, for some people to hear, that even though it's a good project, that would produce a benefit to a certain individual or set of individuals, it didn't have the same widespread benefits that we were looking for in terms of top priority projects. And so that was, I think, hard. In particular, oh, good.
So let me just ask the Planning and Sustainability Commission, you went through the priority list and evaluated them against the criteria. So if we get 50 people showing up advocating for Project X, I'm assuming that your recommendation is say, sorry, we've done the prioritization, this is what it is, rather than, yes,
And
you showed up at the last
We
minute,
did not
wanna
make
move it.
big changes to that list. I mean, really, the only thing was spending the extra money that, was available after we removed the macadam streetcar. And I'll give credit to the Bureau and to Peter Hurley specifically for the prioritization process they led using the transportation expert group and the neighborhoods. I mean, they did such a good job with that it's really defensible, and we didn't feel the need to muck with it in any major ways.
And Commissioner, it's important to note that public support is one of the criteria that we adopted. So public support can be enough to lift something above something that might be close to it but slightly above it in terms of the other criteria. I'd analogize it to when you're talking about whether somebody's in the Baseball Hall of Fame, you look at the statistics, but as Bill James said, you also look at, was the guy really famous?
Right.
So, and that's been done. So,
Oh, yeah, so-
we may get people coming in saying we've made a mistake, and I'm
Right.
hoping then we will have staff ready to say, yes, actually, we did make a mistake, or no, this is why it was further down.
Right. And I think in particular, the demonstrations of public support, to really demonstrate public support, it's not just one voice talking loudly, it's multiple voices saying, we all agree. The neighborhood association has concurred, like sort of variety of levels. And so those projects that were perhaps on the bubble between the constrained and unconstrained, or on the bubble between the first 10 years and the second 10 years, did move based on that feedback. In part also because it demonstrates a willingness to collectively work to deliver those projects, and the possibility that there might be leverage from private institutions and other partners to help fund these projects. We are an enterprising bunch within the transportation industry. We don't have enough money on our own, and so knowing that we're going to need to have LIDs, for instance, including other entities, is key information. So if we hear from a major player that they really believe they want to co-invest in this, that's going to make that project move higher.
I would just add real quickly that the unbundling, I mean, this was a list that went through some transformations, but the unbundling of some of the bigger projects to get to some of the smaller projects addressed, and you can help me here, I think it addressed, from what we heard and staff, I think PBOT did an amazing job of addressing many of the concerns, because the initial list were big projects and people couldn't see inside, and so kind of breaking those apart and saying, where is my project? And either it's on the list or not, help give some clarity and transparency to the list for the public.
And that's certainly manifesting itself even in this year's budget preparation process. Leah's been hearing me push very hard for the need to invest in the programs, even in the near years before we may be successful in additional funding, to demonstrate that we're following through with our intention, as we laid out in the transportation system plan, that we need funding streams to be able to follow through on those small investments. So that's something that I think is key as we're heading through the adoption, is to show that we mean it and we're going to be delivering on those smaller investments. So.
One thing to maybe note, to tie back to your discussion last week, is we did also remove a number of projects as the thinking on Hayden Island evolved. There were a couple projects that were originally in the list designed to support annexation of West Hayden Island that were pulled out of the list as the commission and the council's position evolved. So you may hear about that as well in terms of from the port.
All right. So Courtney Duke, who's been a steadfast carrier of the TSP for many years, is here to make sure you understand kind of what's next, where are we heading from here, and make sure that you're clear on what's in the package that will be coming to council in the coming months, and what is now heading to the Planning and Sustainability Commission.
Hi, thank you. So what we just talked about, the goals and policies, the project list, and the finance plan, we have now termed stage 1 of the TSP update. And so that's what you're seeing today and talking about today. So we went through the finance plan, the policies, and the goals, and the projects and programs. And that's also what some of you know as Task 4, as a part of our periodic review order. So we've been working closely with that. The next stage, which you can sort of see in this blue square in the middle, is what we're working on right now, and that is a part of what's called Task 5, the implementation of the comp plan, and again, we're calling TSP Stage 2. And so we just released a discussion draft on October 2nd, and it includes a bicycle and street design classification descriptions and mapping changes, partly to implement the work that we did with the greenways and the civic corridors, as well as incorporating the bicycle plan of 2010. As we've talked a lot about, we have additional transportation demand management policies and working with the zoning code projects to get that into the code. We have additional performance measures, both in the policy document and looking again at code. We made modifications to the street vacation policies, and they're now created a street vacation code language. So that's going to be in Title 17. We are updating our studies list. Yeah.
Let me just interrupt you there. As you know, I'm really quite concerned about street vacations, and putting it in Title 17 takes it away from the Planning and Sustainability Commission.
No.
No?
Still, at this point, the process is still going through Planning and Sustainability Commission. That's a separate process.
Okay. So I would like a separate briefing
Sure.
on that and a discussion.
I had
And
assumed.
colleagues, my concern is
Yeah.
that the language in the comprehensive plan seems too vague to me, and that we need to be really directive that public right-of-way is really precious and we don't give it up lightly.
Correct. And again, we feel that the changes we've made to the code make it actually stronger and that it's actually the code language, but we definitely want to talk with you about it.
Yeah, I appreciate knowing that there's going to be actual code, which there hasn't been in the
Right.
past, which is great. The code should be directed by the comprehensive plan language, and so currently I'm not seeing that.
Okay. Yeah, and the direction was from city attorney to put it into the code, and so that's one reason we moved that direction. Okay. So we updated our studies chapter, again, based on some of the additional studies that Planning and Sustainability Commission directed us to, as well as just studies that we know we need to meet the growth, as well as studies that came out of some of the changing of the projects. We're updating master street plans, mainly to incorporate already adopted plans that we've done. And then we're needing to modify some of our objectives in the transportation system plan to conform with the new comprehensive plan direction. An example being some of the diversion that Chris had talked about. So again, why are we doing this part of the update? Well, again, it's part of the requirements to meet periodic review. We want to implement the new directions and removing language in the TSP so it is in conformance with the comp plan. We want to incorporate a bunch of adopted plans that we've done since 2007, which we did the last update. And then we're supporting the Bureau of Planning Sustainability Task 5 zoning projects, both the mixed use and the institutional zoning. Again, that's where some of the TDM language code will be. And then again, modifying our city code to implement the comp plan. So again, the discussion draft went out on October 2nd. Some of you may have gotten some emails from constituents concerned that that's what you were looking at at the November 19th hearing, and that is not correct. So what you see on the next page is just sort of the timeline of that update, where we are asking for public comment right now through the end of next week. Then we'll produce what's called the proposed draft. And then we have planning sustainability in January, February, and March at this point is what we're scheduled. And there's nothing scheduled yet at City Council. And then, not to be completely finished with TSP, we'll do what we're calling stage 3. This is outside the comprehensive plan process, what Eric alluded to at the beginning. And that will be that's what we call it post-comp plan adoption. So it's repackaging the TSP, having more geographic specific strategies and other sections. So again, it includes more the bike parking that we've been talking about and to put into it. The geographic strategies are related to our districts and the pattern areas and how we're going to align those. Additional street classification changes. Looking at our modal plans, we have a variety of modal plans inside the TSP, but we also have master plans for a lot of those modes. So we're trying to figure out how the best way to identify those. There might be additional modifications as a result coming out of stages 1 and 2 that we're not aware of yet that we might need to make changes. And then a big lift is reformatting the document and the website to really make it a usable, user-friendly document for both staff and citizens. So that's what our next step will be. We're hoping to have, we were required by the region to be done with stage 3 by December 2016. So that's our goal.
So Courtney, you have been the keeper of this for a very long time. I really appreciate this. I can see awards galore coming down the pike for the way this is presented, it's so much more transparent than when I was involved
Oh,
20-some
great,
years
great,
ago.
thank you.
People can disagree maybe with elements in it or want some tweaks, but it's very clear what you're proposing and why, and so I'm really thrilled with it. Thank you to your whole team.
Yeah, that's really well done. Other requests for follow-up, other than the ones we've already articulated here? For all the time you dedicate, not only in the commission meetings itself, but to be here with us and help guide us through this, so look forward to more. We'll see you next week, right? Do we have another one next week?
Yes, next week is the land use. Also, just to maybe convey to the rest of the council our conversation yesterday, at the mayor's request, we're looking into an additional hearing in December that would potentially, we're exploring options in inner northeast Portland for an additional hearing, and I don't know if we've exactly finalized it, but we were looking at December 8th potentially, so if you could look at your calendars over the next week and get back to us on that.
Is that an evening meeting?
Hasn't been settled, but probably.
Yeah, I think to the extent that we can do evening meetings, that would be good.